So the other aspect of it was then, on the frontiers, they were used to defending themselves. And indeed, there was an author some years ago, and there was a series of Channel 4 called God's Frontiersmen. I don't know if any of you remember it. And it made the point that these people were frontiersmen in Scotland, and they were frontiersmen in America. They were used to being on the frontiers, and they were pioneers on the frontiers. And that was very significant as well. There's two groups of people that are most significant, I think, in terms of the Ulster Scots. The one group of people are the Covenanters, who had very firm religious views, and who also expressed those views in the wider society, and who would, when the time came, formed regiments, went as far as taking on the king, did battle with the king, and they, of course, have connections here, because a lot of them came here to escape from the authorities at that particular time. Most famous of them is a man called Alexander Peden, who went to Glenwherry in County Antrim. He's known as the Prophet of the Covenant. And there were others as well. David Hume went to Kells and was down in Glenarm. And there were Covenanter congregations in Loch Mourne, and also in other parts then further north. And a lot of them emigrated to America. The reason there aren't, I don't think any, well, there's no Covenanter congregation in Loch Mourne now, but that's because most of them probably took ship and went out to America in 1772. But that idea of the Covenanters was very significant, and the Covenanters were hunted down because they wouldn't go and attend worship in the established churches in Scotland, and they met in the moors and the mountains. They formed sentinels who stood guard against the forces of the crown if they came to try and arrest or indeed kill them, as they did do. And the men that formed sentinels eventually became a regiment called the Cameronians. The Cameronian regiment continued in Scotland as a territorial army regiment up until the 1960s. And they were the only British line regiment allowed to carry fixed bayonets to a church service, to highlight the fact they had defended the conventicles against the authorities at that time in the 17th century. So you had a people, the Covenanter people, who were dissenters, who had little time for the authorities and who were prepared to challenge them. And then you had a second group of people, the borderers, who were on the borders between England and Scotland, who were in a very harsh climate, a very sparse area. If you've ever travelled the border down through England, or down through Scotland into England, you know what it looks like. And they were a people, a very dour, determined people. They were called the steel bonnets because there was no point in them wearing nice soft hats on the borders. There was always conflict of some sort, and they had small ponies that they would use to go backwards and forwards. There's a story told of how they would raid across the border for cattle and for livestock, and sometimes it said about the plantation, but if there ever were truly any sheep stealers came here in the plantation, it was probably the borderers, because they indeed were definitely sheep stealers and cattle stealers and all the rest of it. It's said that whenever the larder was getting bare, the woman of the house would come out at the meal time, and she just put a platter down and lifted it, and there was a pair of riding spurs on it, and that was the signal that the larder was bare and it was time to get some food. There's also a story told from the borders that it was so bad that a traveller was going through, and he said to have met this other person and said to them, he was surprised, he didn't see too many churches, and he asked him, he said, "Are there no Christians here at all?" And the man is said to have replied, "No, only Kerrs and Armstrongs." And that gives you a flavour of what the borders was like. Now the borders, whenever King James I came to the throne, he tried to crack down on the borders because they were an embarrassment to him, that there was a no man's land between his two kingdoms, where it was not safe to travel for people that would be waylaid very often. And so he tried to clean the whole act up on the borders. He focused on a number of the clans, and he, through a whole combination of things, he tried to transport some of them, tried to enroll some of them into different regiments and send them off to Europe, and he hung some of them. The most notorious of the clans was the Graham clan. I don't know if there's any Grahams here tonight. always hesitate before saying anything like that. I do know that you'll find Graham's not too far away up the road near Clare, because when he cracked down on the Grahams, he hung a lot of them for different things that they shouldn't have done. He tried to transport some of them to Tipperary, and some of them went voluntarily, went with their own accord, and in order to escape the attention of the authorities as much as they could, they changed their name, some of them, and they spelled it backwards to Maharg. So there's very famous Mahargs around Ballybowling and elsewhere. That's where the name Maharg comes from. They just spelled it backwards. So those people, those borderers, were very fierce and warlike people. And they, in the context of the Ulster plantation, if you go to Fermanagh and Tyrone, you'll find lots of Grahams and Elliots and Armstrongs. That's where they headed to, as far away from authority as they could get. And you see the same thing in America when they go to America. As far away from authority as they could get, onto the frontiers, where there wasn't really any authority, and they made their own authority about them. So that was, those two things are very important to Ulster Scots, and anybody who tries to understand Ulster Scots, and a lot of people have done and still try to do it, can't understand them unless they know about the Covenanters and the Borderers, because those are the key things in the psyche of Ulster Scots. It was no coincidence in 1912, during the Third Home Rule crisis, that people were asked to sign a document, Unionists were asked to sign a document to pledge to stand together. What was it called? The Ulster Covenant. And it was going back to the Solemn League and Covenant of 1638. What it was saying to them was, this is part of your genetic makeup. You know about covenants. You're standing again. And it was very, very significant that was the case. And sometimes some observers, and even some people in government, politicians, will from time to time have made comments about who are these people loyal to. Have you ever heard anybody saying that? Sometimes some of them go further, like Prime Ministers call people spongers. They're essentially saying the same thing. Who are these people loyal to? Well, the answer is, these people have a sense of loyalty which is very different than the sense of loyalty might be in the corridors of power. During the Third Home Rule crisis, they signed the Ulster Covenant, and then out of the Ulster Covenant was born the Ulster Volunteers. They planned up to 80,000 members from those that had signed the Ulster Covenant. Now, there's no real way of getting around it, that the Ulster Volunteers were quite prepared to take on the authorities, and Carson did warn that they would take them on. If they decided to send troops into Ulster, they would take them on. Nobody can gloss over that. And it's very understandable if you look at the whole situation. Who were they being loyal to? Well, they weren't being loyal to a transient Liberal government, in their view. The government would change. The king was who they were loyal to. The king and the crown. And they were so loyal to the crown, they were prepared to fight the government and its troops in order to stay under the auspices of the crown. And that is the complication and the contradiction that some people see in all of this. But they will not understand it if they don't understand that psyche coming out of the idea of the Covenanters and the Borderers, and this idea of a contract between government and people. Nowadays, a lot of politicians, and probably maybe politicians in the south of England, just would not understand this. This is 17th century philosophy, alive and well for a long time to come, I suspect, in this little pocket of Europe. And that's where it comes from. So that's very significant. They're not necessarily, Ulster Scots, an easy people to deal with, and a lot of people can vouch for that over the centuries. But they're the sort of people you need if you want to push back frontiers. There's no point in sending some marble-mouthed politician from Devon or somewhere, off somewhere, to try and push back a frontier. He's not going to do it, is he? You'll send frontiersmen to do that. And that's precisely what they have done through generations. They've done that, they've moved forward. I remember whenever we had a big American week in 1993, I think it was, or 92, and the memorial statue at Kerr Park was unveiled, and there was a service in First Larne Church. The Reverend Lambert McAdoo said that these were the people of the horizon. They were a restless people. They didn't stop. They moved on to the next horizon. They kept on going, and that epitomizes them. They moved from Scotland to here within a generation, a lot of them have moved across to America, pushing towards frontiers.